Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program, we thought we would cover something that most people do, but many people probably don't do intentionally, and that is have a conversation that is intentional. Well, people say, well, I say what's on my mind, and I think people understand my meaning, but do you get to the direction that you want to go as you have this conversation? We find that in the workplace between employees and management, there certainly seems to be a rift there, and that needs to be corrected in particular ways if we want to have better morale and better production. On the program today, we're joined with international speaker, Fortune 500 strategist, and best-selling management author of the book Intentional Conversations. It's how to rethink everyday conversation to transform your career. I'd like to welcome the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Mr. Ken Tucker. Ken, thank you for being on the program today.
Daniel, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Now, this must be one of those things, as you were out there, you discovered there was a real need because, when it comes to conversation, we all certainly know that we can have words flow out of our mouth, but we don't tend to feel and sense the results that perhaps we're looking for. What's going on there?
Well, a lot of managers and a lot of leaders are falling into the trap of thinking that conversation happens automatically. It happens randomly, but it doesn't happen automatically. You really have to be intentional with a conversation.
So let's talk about what an intentional conversation actually is.
Well, there's a secret, and one of your guests would want to know that secret to an intentional conversation, and there is a secret to it. And the secret really is a methodology by which we, human beings, especially if we're trying to be effective in business or in relationships, we can practice a process consistently that makes our conversation far more effective than it is. And so to answer your question, I really want to just talk a little bit and give your guests a little overview of the secret of an intentional conversation. And the word secret really speaks of an acronym, SECRET. And the S stands for suspend status. And this will kind of give you an opportunity to be deeper with me around this. Because about a conversation, something's already happening prior to the conversation. For example, Daniel, even as you prepared for this conversation tonight, you were thinking about what it is you want to accomplish. So we walk into conversations, or we have conversations coming from what I call a place of status. There is some status that's happening in my mind, in your mind. So you saw yourself in your imagination before we started this conversation. You're the moderator, I'm the guest. Well, that automatically puts you in what I call a posture. And that posture speaks of the status you'll take in a conversation.
Now, I like the acronym SECRET, especially when you come to see what the S stands for in this. It's suspending status. Now, let's go ahead and give some clarity to that, what that means exactly, because I think that when our listeners hear this, they're going to become more aware of the conversations they're in and the positions they take. And I'll tell you, anybody who's ever been in something like hospitality realizes how often they experience how there is a lack of suspended status, especially when you're talking to your waiter or your bartender and you want something, your attitude is, well, I'm the customer, so I'm always right. And sometimes there's disdain and even downright scorn in people's voices when they come in with that particular attitude, and then they wonder why they get poor service.
Exactly. Well, the status, or let's change it, the posture. And there are three postures that we'll take in a conversation. What you're speaking of is what is called the one-up posture. So you walk into a conversation with the sense being, I'm one-up in this conversation. I have the authority and the respect. I'm paying my money. I am the customer. It's a one-up posture. The second posture we may assume in a conversation is the one-to-one. Well, he's a human. I'm a human. Yes, they're serving me. But I also at times serve people. I know just how it feels to serve people. So even though he made a mistake in my meal, one-to-one posture I'll take with him, or the status I assume. And then, of course, there's the one-down posture that we may take as well. So we may yell at our waiter, and he or she take a one-down posture. One, they may want to keep their jobs, or two, they just honestly are used to customers feeling, a certain way, and they're ready to take it on by taking the lower position, the one-down position. So those three, Daniel, are all going to be the options we choose as we approach conversations.
Now, you also talk about something in your book, hitting on this specific one here about suspending statuses, that in the workplace that management tends to have a one-up position just due to the fact that that is their position. But as you were saying, this has really become a more outdated modality. It might have been good in manufacturing when you needed somebody to supervise and be sure people were actually productive while they were being paid, but we don't really live in a world quite like that anymore.
One of the things we teach in the book is the analogy of the loaded gun. Every manager or every person with some sort of authority, certainly it's in the workplace is the manager or an executive, sometimes in the home is the parent, or it may be one spouse over the other. But we actually, if we do have a position of authority for some reason or the other, and we may have authority sometimes just because the other person made a mistake and we didn't, but whenever we have that position of authority for whatever reason, we actually have, as it were, a loaded gun. Now, in the management instance, when the manager is walking around, because people know that they have the power to impact their career all the way to termination, it's as if the manager is walking around with a loaded gun. So even if I'm speaking to you on a friendly basis and I'm your manager, in the back of your mind, you're still remembering he's the manager, he's the manager. And sometimes, as you alluded to, sometimes managers actually flaunt this position, flaunt this authority. And sometimes, according to what kind of manager I am, I pull my jacket back so you can see my loaded gun. That's where the rub comes in too many organizations. Still today, you talk about it being an outdated mode of management. Well, the reality is, in my experience as I move throughout Fortune 500 companies, etc., guess what I see? I see this same thing appearing over and over again. Now, it may be a little bit more clothed than it was before. It may be more politically correct than it was before, but it still shows up over and over again.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you when it comes to that. Now, as we pursue secret here, I believe the second one of the E of secret was empower, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about what happens there in this conversation. So first of all, how would you suggest that a person, in starting off an intentional conversation, suspend status? Do they make the decision, okay, well, I'm coming to tell somebody to do something, or I'm coming to ask for something? How do you, suspend that? And what would be ways that you would start that conversation?
Well, it really is, as I mentioned before, it really is about your mindset. And so when we approach conversations, we really have to start by looking at ourselves, because that's what we bring into the conversation. Myself, it really portrayed and demonstrated through the word choices, through the reaction in my words, through the timbre or the temperature of my words. So really, effective intentional conversations is first examining, understanding, and being more. Once we do that, once we become more self-aware, then, and these are sequential, by the way, so the S has to happen first in an intentional conversation. We got to start with this awareness that I'm going to suspend status, because then that lays the foundation for the person. And empowering the other person really is about being present. One of the African countries, in their language, their greeting is pretty interesting. And their greeting goes something like this. All right, I show up and I announce, I am here. You reply, I see you. I am here for you. Notice what's happened there. There's this transformation where now we have what? We have suspended status, and we have automatically validated and celebrated the other person in the room. Most effective managers somehow stumble onto this fact, that they will suspend status, they will empower the other person by validating that he or she has extreme and important value.
Now, you gave a great story in the book about that very thing where you had, there was an employee that was considered to be very brash, and a manager was a situation. Go ahead and tell that story, because I found that to be real unique.
Yeah, so I was working with about 1,400 managers in a company, and the practice was 1 month and introduce some of my ideas, and then I'd come back in 6 months to continue the conversation. Well, the first time I went through, I passed a couple of women were talking about one of the line employees that reported into their group. And as I was passing by, they say, "Oh, yes, we call her Miss Brash." And so that got my attention. I backpedaled. I went up to them. I said, "Tell me about Miss Brash." Oh, they said, "Well, that's not her name. That's just what we call her." I said, "Tell me why you do." She says, "Well, for example, the other day, I called her in, and I said, 'So tell me, what could I do to help you really enjoy your work more?' And her answer was, just give me my termination paper."
Yeah, I'm done. Get me out of here.
Just give me my termination papers. All right? And so the manager, in that moment, I tried to think, do I have enough, to comply with her request? But I didn't, because she's just brash enough to stay within the lines, within the confines, all right, of being employed. But later on, she got reassigned higher level, and he had gotten the story on her. He knew who he was getting, but something occurred to him. For in that moment, he decided that what he was going to do is he was going to try a very different approach, that he was going to indeed empower Miss Brash. He was going to suspend his status, and he was going to figure out a way to empower her. And what he did was he immediately began to ask her to help him in areas where he knew she had expertise. Then he also started asking more of her opinion. So 6 months later, the ladies are back, and so I go up to them and I said, "So tell me, what's the latest on Miss Brash?" And they said, "You'll never believe it." They tell me the story, and that's when they told me this story. And I pursued Jim, the manager who had inherited Miss Brash, to ask him, what did he do? And he empowered Miss Brash.
It's amazing because you look at a couple of things. It's appreciating and respecting what a person's value is in a place, then finding a way to get them to add value for you in a way that they feel they're contributing. And, it's a real simple thing. A lot of people, especially supervisors, are of the impression the best way to make employees happy, for instance, is, they think they want raises when all they really want to be is just appreciated and empowered, is what we're talking about here today.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Gallup organization in one of their well-known surveys is called the Q. But one of the 12 items really actually addresses this, and it makes this statement. All right, my supervisor or somebody at work cares about me as a person. It's one of the most differentiating items in their suite of 12 questions. It's differentiating because when that's present, we are likely to see a high degree of employee engagement in the workplace. And what is it? My supervisor or someone at work cares about me as a person. Got to empower people, because that's one way you show them that indeed. Remember, this is sequential and it's building. So suspend status is the first thing we ought to be thinking about in conversation. How am I presenting my status in this conversation? The second thing is, am I actually thinking about, and Stephen Covey 8 habits of highly effective people. And one of those is what? Seek to understand more than you seek, all right, to be understood. And that's putting the other person, that's empowering the person. When you do these 2 steps, actions, effectively, then you're able to do the 3rd one. So if we started with S, then we did S, we did E, we're on C. And C stands for cultivate connection. You know, when we think about the animals have a way of communicating, but they do not have conversation. This conversation actually inquires the level of intelligence that humans have. The interesting thing about humans is that humans are not born talking.
Right.
And we're not born having conversation. You know how we get to conversation? We mimic conversation. So therefore, if we are mimicking conversation in a home where Spanish is spoken, we are having conversation most likely in Spanish or English or Greek. You got it? So humans mimic conversation. So therefore, whether or not connection to my conversation is probably more about my history than it is about my present. And you can tell people who have grown up in an environment where conversation was used to build bridges. And those who were brought up to practice conversation that separates.
You know, when you talk about connection, too, it's funny how often you can find yourself in a conversation with someone and it seems there's one of 2 things going on. Either they're more interested in you listening to them, or you're listening from a frame of mind that says, I can't wait for you to get finished so I can jump in with what I have to say. You know, there ain't much of a connection there at all.
No. And that's certainly one of the things that we address when we get to the second half of the secret. The first half of the secret really is about what I am doing, what I can intentionally do to positively impact the conversation. The second half of secret is about how I respond and how I may adjust and how I may, reframe, which happens to be the frame, how it is somebody may be interacting with me in conversation. And so it's a very important progression here that we want to start off with what we can do and what we can positively deposit in a conversation for people to receive and appreciate us and for us to show that we receive and appreciate them. The second half is, okay, what about somebody who isn't listening? What about somebody who isn't engaging? What about somebody who is actually being rude? Again, how do we deal with this? And this is what managers started to ask. When we started this research, we started with 700 managers because there was an organization that had 35,000 people. And they were struggling with the fact that the conversation, lawsuits and complaints and all kinds of bad things. And in the book, I note how conversation has been responsible for documented deaths of thousands of people. I mean, it's probably millions, but the work we did, we identified that there were conversations that had they been intentional conversations, they would have prevented deaths. So when we think about being intentional in conversation, we have to think about what it is we can do when the conversation is flowing, but we must also then be equipped when the conversation isn't going to the places that it needs to get to. And that brings us to reframe reaction. SECR. So, in the conversation, one day, Heather is the manager of a kitchen for one of the hospital systems that I worked in. And one day, as she was just passing through the kitchen to get to her office, one of her staff says to her, "Thank you, Miss Heather." And so Heather said, "You're welcome." And she said, I do. Yeah, what did I do? But as she's thinking, the lady's actually following her. And the lady says, no, I really mean it. Thank you. So now Heather begins to think, okay, there's something going on here. And so Heather says, please, just help me remind me what you're talking about. And now the lady begins to tear up, Daniel. She's getting tears in her eyes. And so Heather pulls her into the kitchen office there. And she starts to listen to the lady, and the lady says, you don't know this. But when I came here when you came here to work, when you took over as manager, by that time I had made some decisions. And I had made decisions. I had planned the day, and I had planned the method. I was going to kill myself. That felt worthless. But you came to work here, and you started to ask me to do things. And there were things that I really actually enjoyed doing. And the more you asked me to do those things, you kept saying how good I was and how great I was and how you changed my life, Miss Heather. Thank you. There's power, Daniel. There's power when we consider how it is we can reframe our reaction in conversations, because that's what Heather had to do. I mean, she was just doing the cordial, superficial thank you, and she was going about her work. She was going back to her work. But if we are engaged in the conversation, Daniel, there is some connection that the human is trying to make with the other human. And if we cultivate that connection, it sets us up to reframe our reaction. Or are you going to say something?
Yeah, I remember that story, and it gave me a lot of thought, for instance, especially when it came to, as you said, she was letting this person know the good job, the good work she was doing. And unfortunately, the other side of that coin that I have noticed over the years is that you'll have someone who, picks up the leadership book because they want to be a great leader, and they're certainly with enthusiasm at first trying to put some of these things in play. And one of the shortcomings that I've seen very consistently is when it comes to praising people and how general most of the time that is. For instance, you did a really great job today. And then the next day or, a couple of days after that, you hear the same thing. You did a great job today. Well, after a while, a person's going to hear this, and they're going to take a position that they don't trust you. Because, for one, you're not really getting very specific about what it is they've done so well. And I think in this particular story, and I remember that story, was that she was relatively specific in empowering her to do more and in ways that she was really good at, much as like Miss Brash early in the other story that we had there. And so when you decide that you're going to do this, for those listening out there who may have employees or people that work with them, is being specific, reframe, as you said, about what it is that you want to praise. And I think a great leadership book out there is the 1 Minute Manager, especially because we're talking about something that's the same, but it's a little bit different right here. But, I just wanted to kind of point that out, that you don't really want to be general, especially if it comes to something like praise.
What's so interesting about this, Daniel, is it allows us to remind your listeners and to remind ourselves that whenever a conversation is happening, it's happening with two or more persons. So in that situation where I may have been the guilty manager who too often is saying, great job, Daniel, great job, Daniel, the other person in that conversation has every opportunity to engage further around the conversation. Well, think about it, okay? She is saying it to you. He is saying it to you. They've already invited you into that conversation. Oh, how about this? Oh, Ken, I really appreciate you telling me. Great job. I honestly, I really do appreciate that. You might give me a specific example, all right, so I could do more of that. Tell me some more about that. Tell me so I could really, know exactly how it is I can continue to do a good job here. That's the next process or step in the process of secret. That's about enforcing engagement. It's about saying, oh, wait a minute, we're having this conversation. You've been telling me how great I am, but I'm beginning to feel like you're disingenuous, or I'm not sure what it is I'm doing. But boy, if I could ask the simple question, Daniel, thank you. Can you tell me exactly, help me. What did I do again? I really would like to know.
Right. That. Exactly. The next letter, of course, is the second E in secret. And here you had an astounding story that involved a co-pilot and a pilot of an airline. Tell us about that.
So what I was just talking about is this second E, the enforced engagement, right? And notice the words. They're so well chosen. That word. Hey, if you go back to the first three, notice how unassuming and non-assertive those three words are. You suspend, right? You cultivate, okay? You empower. Notice those. The moment we get to the second half of the secret, reframe. We reframe. We're actually going to take something that has been said, and we're going to change that, change the words, change the idea behind it. We're gonna take control of it. That's what enforce is about as well, Daniel. That's why when I said there are two people in the conversation, the one who is complimenting all the time, and it's not having its desired impact, and it's certainly beginning to rise suspicion, it's on me. I have that opportunity as well to enforce now. And doesn't mean get in somebody's face. Sometimes it may, but it doesn't have to get in somebody's face to enforce engagement. You can enforce engagement by asking an honest question, just as we did in that example. Well, this was the case on Flight 90. People are familiar with this. I live and work in the Washington, D.C. area, and I was around for when this happened. And some people, again, will remember this, that January 13, 1982, Flight 90, a 737 airplane, crashed right in the Potomac. Hundreds of people died. And we have on record the original transcript. And to cut it short, let me illustrate. One of the tools, Daniel, that I apply in the organizations I work with when I'm dealing with improving communication, improving conversation effectiveness, is called a conversation audit. And I gave you just a little view of it, a little glimpse of it when I talked about conversation always, or a mindset. We always walk into a conversation with a posture, with some mindset. While we're in that conversation, we're also trying to exert some kind of influence. We're trying to impact behavior in some way. I mean, even just a brief exchange of two in the morning, right? You walk past your neighbor, you walk past a colleague, and you say, hi. In that moment, you're seeking to do what? You're seeking in some way to influence that other person with those two little letters. Hi. You also have expectations that they're going to give you some kind of... When we take apart conversation, we look to see what is the posture or the mindset, because that's going to tell us potentially what is the reaction or the response going to be. If I walk past you in the morning, forgive the illustration, if I walk past you in the morning, instead of saying hi, I hold up one of my fingers. You know what I mean? That gets a very different response, a different reaction. But it was also a very different mindset that I had. So the pilot and the co-pilot, prior to that flight taking off, had a conversation. And it's like this. The co-pilot says, look how the ice is just hanging on the tail of that plane. Do you see that? The pilot responds, yeah. Now, why did that co-pilot say that? The co-pilot was beginning to say, so the pilot doesn't buy into the invitation for that conversation. He says, yeah. So then the co-pilot comes back and he says, it's been a long while since the last de-icing. Notice this now. He's going further in the conversation. He's trying to get more response. The pilot No response. Silence. So guess what? The CoPilot comes back again. He says a lot of time for new ice buildup in this storm. You know, this is a losing battle trying to de-ice these things. It just gives you a false sense of security. Now, right about here, Daniel, we're seeing what the CoPilot is attempting to do, but we are beginning to see what he's failing to do. And what he's failing to do is enforce engagement. Enforce engagement. You're standing up talking to somebody, and their eyes are off in the distance, and you can see that they're thinking what's. You have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to walk away and leave them if you want, or you have an opportunity to enforce engagement. To simply say, hey, I notice you've been looking over my shoulder. What is that? What's going on? You know, or you could say, you know, I'm not so sure you're hearing me. What can I do for you to pay attention to me in this conversation? So the CoPilot is trying to have a conversation, an important one, in fact, a life or death one. The pilot is not engaging, and the CoPilot is failing to enforce engagement. So we go on in this transcript. So then silence from the pilot. So moments later, the plane is cleared for takeoff, and the plane is speeding down the runway and is starting to climb. The CoPilot speaks up again. This is historical data. The CoPilot speaks up again. He says, look at that indicator. Right? Does it? Now the pilot is silent again. CoPilot speaks up again. That's not right. Pilot now speaks up. He says, yes, it is. There's 80. CoPilot, no, I don't think that's right. Well, maybe it is. I don't know.
Now let's talk about the. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, the transcript says the stall warning begins to sound. The pilot now speaks up. First time we hear him speak up, come on, forward. Seconds later, the CoPilot, Larry, we're going down. Larry, pilot, I know. End of the story.
Rough.
Intentional conversation, man. This is in many, many instances. You got to learn how to have an intentional conversation. It's so true. It's true. It's true in the workplace. It's true at home. And it's true in many, many high risk jobs. You got to learn how to have intentional conversations. Got to enforce it.
Right.
Sorry.
I was going to say, now let's go ahead and talk about the T with the few minutes that we do have left on the program.
Every conversation is going to have a lot of words and few key ideas. It does occur. And a professional, a medical person, a medical professional is present. He or she will go into what is called triage. They're going to look at the injured and determine which ones need immediate attention and which ones can be made to wait and survive. Well, that's what we must do with every conversation. Through all the ideas and all the words that have been expressed, even on this conversation. All right? And you have to then do what? Triage. Choose the ones that are most important to you taking the action that's required, or for you to walk away having value from the conversation. And tonight, if you were to triage this conversation and I were to instruct you what I would suggest you walk away with the idea that there's a secret to intentional conversation. That there is exactly a process that we can learn to do and just understand how it is we may prepare when we have the time for conversations, or in spontaneous conversations, begin with suspending status, look to cultivate connection, think about how we may empower the individual. So suspend status, empower the individual, cultivate, reframe, and then enforce engagement, and then triage. going to be taken away, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Triage.
It's a little bit, but it's unique that if you put this, in play, and you'll certainly have plenty of opportunities, you're going to find yourself in a lot more intentional conversations, and I think you'll be richly rewarded in many ways that you couldn't even imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for those who want to continue the conversation, my website is KTA website. The easiest one is kentucker.me. Kentucker.me. And my email is kta@me.com. That's kta@me.com or kentucker.me.
Well, very good. Ken, I want to thank you for being on the program today and sharing your book, Intentional Conversations. I know it's something that a lot of people will find great value with.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for the time to share my ideas. I appreciate it a lot.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.